Hey there, it's Ron Gula with another episode of Gula Tech Cyber Fiction. Today we are going to interview, he says Mr., but I'm going to call him General Tom Ayres. General, how's it going?
It's going great, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. How are you enjoying civilian life?
It's been good. I left uniform about 3.5, 4 years ago, and I said it had to be God's plan because I couldn't escape the Pentagon. The Pentagon was the last place I wanted to be. So then I was the general counsel for the Air Force and Space Force out of uniform for 3 years.
That's phenomenal. So thanks for your service.
Thanks.
And you are a soldier, but you're also a lawyer.
Right.
So how did you get into the service? How did you practice law? What was that like?
So I went to West Point, and that all happened because of football. I ended up not playing football for very long at West Point, but did that the West Point thing, then went in the infantry. I was serving over in Italy, great place to serve, and sat on a court-martial panel. Sitting on a court-martial panel, it was a child sexual assault case. I was the junior member of an all-officer panel for an enlisted soldier and thought, boy, this is really interesting, and then applied for the funded legal education program. So changed from running around the woods with a weapon to advising commanders who run around the woods with weapons.
A different form of combat, right?
That's right.
Combat with paper.
Yeah.
And words and logic. And, I think a lot of us in cybersecurity think that they know everything because cyber is the center of the universe, right? But
Right.
having a legal view, I think, is really interesting. So,
Yeah.
so today we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're
Right.
going to talk about, maybe some of the legal issues with Cyber Command and
Right.
maybe some of the ability for commercial companies to defend themselves. And do you say letters of marque or letters of marque? What's the right way to talk about this?
I say Mark, but I know other people have a better French accent than I do, so I'm not going to
Marque.
denigrate anybody.
Je ne parle la langue de français.
Right, right.
It's
Oui,
all good.
mais oui.
And then you were also, it's very apt for the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction show, you helped set up Space Force.
That's right.
So we're going to talk
Yeah.
about that as well. So that's
Be happy
phenomenal.
to.
What are you doing today? Where are you at today? What are you working on right now?
So today I'm an adjunct with the RAND Corporation, working on some background projects for Project Air Force and some of their cyber efforts. I'm also CEO of my own consulting company, Lead Up Strategies, talking about space and cyber, and on a couple advisory boards.
So I always remember Rand from growing up watching Sesame Street. Every episode of Sesame Street was brought to you by the Rand Corporation, right?
That's right.
So Rand, what does Rand do to it? What are they doing today?
Well, it's interesting. I'm from Pittsburgh. I didn't know until now that the RAND Corporation Project Air Force is in Pittsburgh. It's centered in Pittsburgh. And that's probably where the whole PBS thing, Mr. Rogers actually lived down the street from me where I was growing up in Pittsburgh when I lived at my grandmother's house. They're working on, lots of different things. We're thinking about how we can better secure our national security. I think the biggest thing is that, it's not just that we need to build better weapon systems. We need to be able to communicate better. And so cyber is a big part of that. How do we control our data? How do we control the linkages, the web services? And that's not normally the big five defense contractors who do the R&D in that are small, innovative companies and some large companies, but some of them don't want to play in the defense space. So how do we reach out to those companies?
So let's get right into that then.
Yeah.
So how are we doing as a nation in cyberspace?
I don't think we're doing very well. I think that there's legal hurdles, there's practical hurdles, and then there's incentives for others to roam the cyber seas and to take advantage of our legal fissures, and also to try. They're trying to make a buck, and then there are others who want to. They don't want the United States to be the world superpower. And so they want to be this world superpower, and specifically our strategic, competitors, China and Russia.
How much do you see the openness and transparency of the United States, society and our partners like United Kingdom,
Right.
as such a juxtaposition and opposite from China and Russia?
So I think it's a great advantage. I mean, it's obviously it's a disadvantage in some ways, but it is our greatest advantage, and that's where this idea, and I'm sure we'll get into it more, but the Chinese model is autocratic capitalism. They're trying to make money, but they want to direct everything centrally from a government. Our model is democratic capitalism, and And so we can't control this just with the NSA. I mean, the issues we're having in cyber right now, the NSA alone can't fight all our cyber battles. We need to find a way that private enterprise and the thing that's always made America great, that Yankee know-how and ingenuity, that now has great diversity as well, that our competitors don't have. That diversity of thought, we can win these efforts if we harness private enterprise. That's my view.
So you wrote a really well-written article in the Wall Street Journal that came out about 2 weeks ago from the time we're recording this. And that was the same week the President Biden's executive order came out with a whole host of like recommendations and requirements for cybersecurity. So let's get into the article, but I'm always interested in, so how did you, did you shop the article? Did any other news outlets pass on printing it?
Well, the Wall Street Journal is always my first choice. I've published quite a few articles, and Wall Street Journal has published one of my articles before, and so I always go to the Wall Street Journal first, and they showed some interest, and so I didn't have to shop it after that. I mean, you normally when you take an article to a major publication, you have to say exclusively yours for the next 36 hours.
Did they make any changes to it?
They made some changes. They actually,
Really?
the main editor had some really good questions for me. And so the most changes were made by me he wanted me to, flush out a couple parts. And then he made some minor changes to that just to shorten it a bit.
That's excellent. Because I think a lot of people, they see an op-ed and they just think you can, send an email in, and it's a collaborative process.
No, it was collaborative. Yeah,
And-
there were 4 versions with him.
And in many ways, it's kind of an endorsement as well to give it out there. So what did you say in the article?
Well, what I said in the article is what we already introduced a little bit, Ron. It's that we're seeing the same thing that happened in the seas with the Barbary pirates back in 1801 and 1805. We're seeing some actors who are using safe haven in countries, and they're attacking us. So it was timely because I had written the article right before Colonial Pipeline, and I was just getting ready to finalize it. Colonial Pipeline happened, and I added that to the idea that, hey, there are people who are attacking our infrastructure. And they're really the equivalent of pirates of those days because they're using safe haven of big countries, and then they're taking advantage of that system. And so let's create privateers to attack them back, just as we did with pirates in the Barbary Wars.
And the historical reference is called Letters of Marque,
Right.
and historians will probably say, or maybe linguistic people will say, Letters of Marque,
Marque, okay.
because it was a French.
That's right.
idea.
It was definitely a French idea. It had been used well before the United States used it, but it's included in our Constitution. That's the other thing I think, that our Constitution doesn't have that many words, and when something's included in there, maybe we should take advantage of it and take a look at it. And so the fact that it was important enough to the founders that they included that Congress could grant letters of marque and reprisal, or marque, that I thought, well, let's look at that and see that something that's used back then maybe has a use today. Something that was good for the maritime world may be good for the cyber world.
The book Ghost Fleet.
Yes.
There's a scene in Ghost Fleet where in space, not in cyberspace,
Yep.
but in space, a British,
Yeah.
multi-billionaire
Yeah.
asked for letters of marque to attack a
Right.
Chinese,
That's right.
space weapon.
That's right.
And I think a lot of people have read that book. It's a
That's
very
right.
famous
It's
book.
a great book.
And
I've read it.
And do you think that kind of took some fiction into this concept? Like some of the criticisms of
Yeah.
Letters of Marque is like, this is science fiction. It was in a book.
Right.
But you're like, it's in the Constitution. It's
It's
a real
it's
thing.
really interesting, Rod. We didn't talk about this before, but I'd read that book, and then I was working on the creation of the Space Force and drafting legislation to create the Space Force. That idea came to me, and from having read that book, Ghost Fleet. And so we actually talked with the Space Force leaders about talking to Congress about there may be a time in the future, and maybe soon, where our satellites, we need to defend them, or arm them so they can defend themselves, just the satellites, even if they're unmanned. So a little bit a step back from what the book said. And so we had discussions about that, about whether we would, in the creation of the Space Force, make a provision for being able to grant letters of marque to companies that we cooperate with in the defense industry. And there's lots of public-private ventures in space. There's big satellites, and they have lots of different, they're called buses, and they have payloads on them that are, many are government, many are private. So there's lots of public-private ventures. And so the whole idea for this article came from those discussions I had about that book you just mentioned, Ghost Fleet,
Excellent.
and that fiction.
I would love to have that book made into a movie.
Oh, I
So
would
it's,
too.
It's good stuff. And I'm sure we'll talk about maybe the next book, 2034. Not from the same author, but it's in the same kind of vein of war with China involving cyber.
I haven't read that one yet, but
It's on my next list.
Yeah.
So, but back to letters of marque for cyber. This is not necessarily a new idea. It's been around for a while. I can, I go back. Tom Bossert and Dmitry Oparovich, they debated it. I think Dimitri's now on the side of he's against letters of marque. But what are some of the arguments for letting people do this, and what are some of the arguments maybe against this?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest one against it is that you start to empower actors that may do harm, that they would become over emboldened, and they would actually put our national security at risk. So in going after actors, they would be seen as actors of war.
So I'm Citibank.
Yep.
I think I'm attacked by Iran.
Right.
So I do something to Iran. And I don't know, maybe they think it's Israel and they start a war with Israel, something like that. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think you'd have to make sure that there's some boundaries there. There's a knowledge of how it happens. The benefits are, again, where you've got actors who have safe haven. If the NSA were to do something, they were to take action, it could be viewed as an act of war. Whereas maybe a private company protecting itself and maybe counterpunching, it might not be viewed as an act of war, and it probably shouldn't be viewed as an act of war. And so, how do we empower that? The other thing, the biggest thing is, just as in the days of piracy, we had a very small fleet. We had the Enterprise, which was a schooner of 14 guns. They started building the 6 frigates.
Made in Baltimore.
Yeah, that's right, made in Baltimore. and so, but you had a great fleet of merchant ships. And so getting those merchant ships, incentivize them to put cannons on them and then maybe go counterpunch again, that was the idea. And I think the same thing. The NSA is a great organization. They've got a lot of capabilities, but they can't protect all of the cyber world for the United States. There's just too much going on.
And it's funny because I think a few years ago, I probably would have incorrectly said, and it's not their jurisdiction, but the defend forward policy is literally, we're going to get in other people's stuff and get in their business and prevent them from doing harm to the U.S.
That's right.
So I really wonder when you use the schooner and the limited size of the fleet, when you look at SolarWinds and Exchange and Colonial Pipeline, did we stop like 300 other things, but these 3 got through, or did these 3 get through and we had no idea they were going to happen? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the other thing that's true is that these, I'm not really sure. You'd probably be better to know that than I about how many we've stopped, and we talked to somebody at NSA. But I know that they know the limitations. They know that Cyber Command, is not going to look at what's going on inside a U.S. company and the data. It's against the law, and they know that NSA has a lot of limitations, and so they use our laws against us, just again, like pirates use safe haven in a foreign country. And so they are navigating the waters of where they know Cyber Command and the NSA can protect and where they can't. And so they just like SolarWinds, they use private companies as a launch pad to get into many other systems, right? And so you need more cooperation, I think, between those companies and the NSA and federal government.
So let's talk about some of the technology. So with the historical context, you're talking about boats defending themselves, putting cannons on them.
Right.
And if you extrapolated that to today,
Yeah.
We see cruise ships with sonic weapons that if Somalia pirates come up, they can defend themselves, right?
Right.
I think everybody's okay with that, right?
Right,
That
right.
makes sense.
Yeah.
In cyber, we always think about, we're going to hack back.
Right.
But the reality is a lot of organizations are already trying to impede command and control.
Right.
That might be interpreted as an act of war,
Yeah.
or it could just be dissolving a botnet. If you have a botnet on your network and for somehow you have a threat intelligence provider like Recorded Future or Flashpoint, and they can literally name the hackers' names and where they live in some cases, is giving those dossiers to law enforcement, is that an act of war? Because that's happening all the time.
Yeah.
And that's right up to that line of what is, what does hackback really mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good point because I think the whole point of the article was let's find the right incentives and disincentives. And I don't think I had all the answers. And actually, what I've really liked over the last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of discussion. The article has spurred some discussion about, all right, what are the right incentives and disincentives? So I was thinking incentives in terms of, well, let me go back a step to the letters of Marque. I mean, the big incentive then was if you went and captured a pirate ship, you could then take that ship and everything in it, and you bring it to an admiralty court, say, I was authorized to do this action, and the title of that ship became yours, everything in it became yours. And legally it was yours. And so that's a huge incentive. I mean, ships were very expensive to build back then. So, so it's hard to think, I'm not talking about the same kind of incentive, although I've had some people recommend, all right, maybe if you were to hack back, maybe the data there'd be some prize for the data that you recapture.
Or replace
some
data.
kind of reward,
Yeah.
or the intellectual property that you get back. Maybe there's some kind of reward. Maybe the Microsoft or whoever was hacked or Colonial Pipeline wouldn't pay for their data back, but maybe the government gives you some kind of reward for that.
What if the data was Bitcoin?
Yeah.
A lot of these companies, I mean, and I think I saw a statistic, the FBI has like more Bitcoin at this point because of Silk Road and,
Right.
and that sort of thing. Have you ever met Tom Kellerman? I don't mean to drop a name.
I haven't.
So Tom's a friend of ours. He helped start Strategic Cyber Ventures. He's over at VMware now through their Carbon Black acquisition, but he's a fellow at the Wilson Center. He's often written and talked about the same way, like in the fight against drugs,
Yep.
we see these cartels money. Those assets go towards the fight against, drugs. I really wonder if we start doing this hackback thing, or the government gets more involved with getting the crypto ransomware back. We can use that to fund a number of things.
Right.
You might even have, some people have suggested, for example, at Colonial Pipeline, you need to have a license to pay the ransomware if you're going to do so. Well, maybe we could use some of the money that the government has in Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. There have also been discussions though. If we just ban Bitcoin, then a lot of the ransomware, that's the way they can not be found out when they receive the ransom.
China seems to be going that way, right?
Yeah. So, but I just don't think that that's practical as well. I mean, there's always going to be a way. Cryptocurrency is here to stay in one form or another. Whether we start to regulate it and normalize it or not is a big question. But it's not going away. I don't think we can just ban Bitcoin or its progeny.
Let me ask you about the proliferation of cyber weapons. You have the book. They tell me how the world ends, which talks all about the cyber weapons and whatnot. And we've got a couple investments in companies that do that kind of stuff. Are you concerned at all that if we turned sort of the people who are writing tools for Cyber Command and the FBI and the CIA and made that kind of stuff available to corporations or private law enforcement, that type of thing, is that going to cause an even bigger arms race? Is that going to be a problem?
Well, I will say that private corporations are already incentivized to defend themselves, right? So one of the points of the article was they're defending themselves. They're spending some money on it, but they don't want to be scouts for the NSA. Sometimes they lock down immediately because there's huge disincentives. So if you get hacked, one of the first things that happens is, you want to find out the scope of the problem. And not the first thing is to tell law enforcement or the NSA that you've been hacked, because you're worried about your share price and all those kinds of things. So they have incentives already for defensive weapons. But, different than in the days of cyber piracy, it's not as easy as just buying one brass cannon or a couple brass cannons to defend the boat. There are so many different threats, so many different things, and people make risk determinations. And so perhaps one of the ideas, and I didn't include this in the article, and it's maybe something I want to talk to you about offline, but perhaps there's a way you could team with the NSA. Hey, NSA, if you give us this network of tools, and then we promise, if you give us these tools, that we're going to be your scouts forward. We're going to share information with you back. And then NSA would have some limits on that, so it's not that arms race that you talked about. The NSA would be involved, but you'd be empowering. Basically buying the cannons of different types to give to the merchant ships out there to defend themselves.
Yeah, I think that's been discussed, and I generally think it's a great idea. I mean, we started with the ISACs, so so the question is always is, okay, I'm the CISO of a bank.
Yeah.
On one hand, wouldn't it be great if the NSA just gave me a list of IP addresses I could block and I'd be secure? Well, it's not that simple, right?
No.
It's very fast moving. Maybe they can't share that. But they're starting to share it, and I think it was a pretty bold step that they kind of came out about, I think it was a year ago, that they said, here's the 20 or so CVEs, vulnerabilities that China's using to rip off America.
Right.
Go fix these. Like, that's really useful. The problem is like all things with cyber, they expect it to be like this exciting Matt Damon on the keyboard thing. When you boil it down, like China's using these 20 CVEs to steal billions of dollars, and all you got to do is go fix it. It becomes less exciting.
Right.
And I also think it's interesting that Keith Alexander, former director of the NSA, General Alexander, running IronNet, he's pushing collective defense, which I think is a really great marketing concept approach, because you can then, you're not representing the industry. You have the ability to anonymize, which is a big problem with reporting and sharing with the NSA.
Yeah.
I'd like to think it could go both ways. I really do.
Yeah. Well, I think collective defense is a great idea. I think the other thing it gets to that I try to point out in the article is because it's not just the disincentives to sharing information, and you're worried about your stock share, but you're also worried about regulators coming in and saying you didn't do enough to protect data, and so you've seen that. You've seen hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to different companies. Equifax, Uber, Home Depot have all been fined for not doing enough to protect their consumer data. And then also potentially privacy suits, privacy advocate suits when you don't protect the data. So, but if you were then in this collective defense, you're taking all those measures and sharing across a consortium. That would be, I think that private industry should get behind that.
It definitely is a good thing. And it's not something that I think the average citizen understands. So I really like this discussion about the letters of marque, because it draws the public in. It's such a visual image of the privateers, fighting back against the pirates. And then I think people are frustrated when they're waiting in gas lines, because of colonial pipelines. So, but at the same time, I think the public needs a bigger role in cyber policy. So I'm happy that that we're kind of having this discussion, and I think collective defense is a great way of doing that. And it's not just for large enterprise. I really believe a small business, they're paying a little bit to an IT shop who could be doing probably a lot more, but hey, I'm paying Larry, my IT guy, to come in and patch my computers once a month. Hey, unless you're doing hunting and hygiene and listening to these NSA advisories, you're probably not taking enough serious. It's just like not paying attention to your health and whatnot.
Yeah, you hate to for us to have an incident worse than Colonial Pipeline, for us to see that the risks are already there. I mean, that's I think the other point here. Let's not wait for the next Pearl Harbor, the cyber Pearl Harbor, before, or the next 9/11, a cyber 9/11, before we all this 9/11 changed everybody's lives. We thought about security differently, physical security differently, and I don't want to have us be put in a situation where, because of what just happened, now we're going to expend the resources for a collective defense. Let's do it ahead of time. We know the threats are there. We know the vulnerabilities are there.
Yeah, so I think this discussion is great. Another one that I thought was going to get more discussion but didn't was how the FBI handled the Exchange server hacking. They basically, you could say they entered into these botnets, right? Or you could also say they hacked into these Exchange servers and removed the botnet. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I really actually, Ron, I don't know very much about that. Certainly, I think I want to empower the FBI and others to attack when we're attacked, and so I don't have a problem with it. What are the downsides of it?
So let's say maybe they do a little bit more proactive next time. Hey, we've connected to you and we fixed these things to make it defendable, right? So there's a lot of privacy concerns. Was there was every one of those organizations informed ahead of time? Well, you got operational security concerns. What are the roles and norms of that? When will it happen again? Could they do it again for 100 hosts? What about one host?
Right.
So what are the rules? And I think that's kind of an
Yeah.
interesting thing. I think
Right.
with many things cyber, it's too technical to discuss publicly,
Right.
and it also gets too sensitive to discuss because it's very timely. So then the
Right.
public's completely left out.
Right.
And I would just love to see more. I'm surprised there wasn't more public discussion about that
Yeah.
because that's a big deal. I mean,
Yeah.
good job. I want our nation to try new things and different things as we go into the future here in this whole new dimensions. I think it was an interesting thing. I'm
Yeah.
sure they had legal cover.
I'm sure they did. They wouldn't, I mean, the great thing, my experience, being an advisor to commanders for 3 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then in the Pentagon, we as the United States, we always uphold the rule of law. And we are the champions of human rights throughout the world. And those include privacy rights. And so I think we want to continue in that vein. We want to be seen as the most free nation in the world. And part of that is our data, free to share it or not share it. And so I think that's the other thing that you point to is I think people are really concerned about their private data being shared out. And sometimes they allow it to be shared out, and sometimes they are unwilling participants in it being shared out because they haven't checked the privacy settings on their things. But sometimes they're part of the OPM breach, and so their data is out there, and who knows what entities have it on the dark web.
So I think I'm really happy that you wrote the op-ed because it's again spurring this public discussion. And one of the things I really liked is the idea of licensing people that if you're going to pay ransomware, like in Colonial Pipelines,
Right.
you have to at least have a license to do that and share that with the government. I think that's amazing
Yeah.
because it's really hard to go the other way and incentivize good defenses. Like I think there's new regulation coming out this week for all pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it's gonna be better than what they had, and I'm sure they can probably still be hacked.
Yes.
So the question is what does that get us? And we can't find people. Like if you find Colonial Pipeline $1 million, they're just going to pay it.
Yeah.
Because they're making hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
So it's this hard thing to balance how dependent we are on our infrastructure,
Right.
and how much investment they should have to keep it secure.
Yeah. There's the untold part of the story, and which we can discuss is right. Colonial Pipeline, they paid. Again, just like many companies will, because they're concerned about their reputation, their brand, and if they're caught up in having their data and their services not available for weeks or months, I mean, their brand and their reputation goes down. So a one-time payment they see as beneficial. The problem is, as someone else has written, if companies just say we will never pay ransomware, then you're not going to get attacked. Well, maybe not, because they'll test you. And you would like to think that would fix it, but everyone has their price. So I think what's interesting with this strike too is I don't think DarkSide understood that they were doing something that would be seen as a national security, hitting a national security asset. And so it may be that those who allowed them to operate in their space said, maybe that wasn't such a good move. You've got to know the limits, because again, I think in cyber, things are pretty mature. People, I think, know what's an act of war and what's not an act of war. But sometimes they get that calculation
Yeah,
wrong.
there's still a gray line, right?
There's still a gray line.
Like if this
Big gray area.
if this happened during the Texas winter storm,
Right.
which again seems like fiction, but it's an unfortunate reality.
Yeah.
That could have been an act of war.
Right.
And that's just science fiction, right coming into the headlines.
Yeah.
So, and it really reminds me of the mob,
Yeah.
where it's like, the mob's going to shake you down for a little bit, but not too much because it'll attract, federal government intrusions. I think one of the interesting things that was coming out of the Colonial Pipeline hack is where are the American gangsters, and are they hacking China and Russia and stuff like that? And you hate to kind of throw something like out there, but come on, we got to catch up, right? We got a deficit here.
Well, again, that's the interesting part of maybe there's letters Marque for the American, the white hats to go and do some things back. But then how do you incentivize that again? If their data could be then the equivalent of prize money, their intellectual property that they recover back, or if they counterstrike.
Yeah. So I'd like to get your opinion on one last thing, and we'll talk about Space Force and some
Sure.
other cool things next. So a lot of folks say if you use cyber weapons, it's going to have an escalating effect. But to date, we've really seen the opposite.
Right.
Trump administration used offensive cyber twice. Both times it seemed to be like a de-escalating thing, once against Russia, once against an Iran anti-missile thing. What are your thoughts on this going forward? Is that a rule going forward? Or is every situation going to be different?
I think every situation is going to be different. I think there are certain things. The law of spying. Many people talk about the laws of land warfare, but there's also this notion that there's certain things that they're not really legal, but they're not really illegal, right? I mean, it wasn't really legal for us in the 60s to fly U-2s over Russia, but at the same time, it wasn't completely illegal. It wasn't, because every nation has done some sort of spying on other countries. And so there is a developed law of spying, even though it's not written down anywhere. So I think you see that a lot in the cyber world. Everyone's trying to figure out what's out there, what's on the net. And sometimes in their bumbling around the net, they may do things that have an adverse impact. But I also think, just like flying over Russia in the 60s, trying to figure out what they have, is also, in case something happens, you want to be ready. And so there's a whole interesting aspect there. And apart from that, though, you have the whole laws of land warfare and laws of warfare. And so you do kind of know where the acts of war are, but it really comes down to, is life, limb, eyesight at issue? Are you doing things that are going to have an effect on people's lives? But then you also, you have these gray areas, as you said. What about sovereignty? An impact on an election, an impact on an electrical grid. So there's a lot unknowns here. Can it be used to send messages? Absolutely. Then maybe, we have the diplomatic, informational, military, economic, the old DIME that you learn about in the Army War College that I learned about. You think about all four of those things when you get into a near crisis. Maybe we need to add into that DIME a whole cyber component to think through the cyber toolkit, as well as the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic tools that you have to de-escalate or escalate a situation.
That's excellent. So I really appreciate you coming on to talk about Letters of Marque. And that was a great op-ed. Really happy with the conversation it did. But I think a lot of our viewers might not know that you helped set up Space Force, and we should put some time talking into that.
Okay.
So what was your role? Have you been to space?
I have not been to space.
All right. So that's
a lot of space between the years.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So what was your role in setting up Space Force?
So, again, having a full career in the Army, I didn't know very much about space, but as I became the General Counsel of the Air Force, soon after I became the General Counsel, President Trump said, we're going to have a Space Force. So I was given the task to quarterback the drafting of the legislation, and several other folks with me, the director of the Joint Staff, the director of the Air Staff, and the vice director for space. The four of us got together on the Saturday after he said that, and we said, okay, how are we going to move forward in this? What are we going to do to create a Space Force? And so that meant we had to draft some legislation. But before you draft legislation, you have to have a lot of policy decisions. So it meant putting together groups to figure out what exactly we wanted to create a Space Force.
What's time to what year was that?
That was June of 2018. He said that.
So that was right after election.
Yep.
And then I remember the announcement was like 20. It's about a 2-year process.
Yeah, it was about a 2-year process. Yeah. So for first thing, what a lot of people don't understand is, there was a couple pieces. What can the president do on his own to increase our focus on space and national security? And what he could do on his own was create Space Command. That had been something that had been created years ago, was abolished, and then he recreated. Space Command, it takes all of the tools that the services give it, and it then can plan for defending our assets in space.
And could you? Oh, go ahead.
But that's different than Space Force, where it's a force, as we say, to organize, train, and equip forces to be prepared for future conflicts. So that takes an act of Congress.
Okay. So in military jargon,
yeah,
we've got the Department of Defense.
Yep.
We got Chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Right.
We got Army, Navy, Air Force, and I guess Marines, right?
And
I'm going
Marines.
to take a lot of crap for that, right? Even,
Right.
are they with the Navy? Are they next to the
They
Navy?
are. They are.
Right?
They are
Right?
part of the Department of
Right?
the Navy.
And then sometimes the Coast Guard when they come in from
That's right.
DHS, right?
Right.
Where is Space Force in that? Just for the general public.
Space Force is similar to the Marine Corps as part of the Department of the Navy. Space Force is part of the Department of the Air Force. And so we looked at all the models. We looked at a Coast Guard model, we looked at a full department model, and then we looked at a Marine Corps model. And we thought the Marine Corps model is the best because you don't have to replicate everything, all the bureaucracy. Because the biggest concern was you're just creating a bureaucracy, and there's not that many troops in space. You know, there's none there, but there are many, about 16,000 are supporting space operations. And so, so if you're going to have a small force, let's not create our own medical corps, our own JAG corps, budget people, inspector generals. So let's take advantage of what's already there in the Air Force, just like the Marine Corps can concentrate on marine operations, and they can rely upon the Navy for a lot of that bureaucracy.
So as a lawyer,
Yeah.
you're going in to meet with Congress, senior people in the Department of Defense, White House.
Yeah.
What was that like? What were those meetings like? How much was classified and unclassified? How much was just bureaucratic? Hey, not on my turf.
So I think that the main point in all of these discussions that Congress needed to be on board because it takes an act of legislation. The main point was the message: we built a world, a glass house in a world without stones. We have multi-billion-dollar satellites up there. Many of those were planned and bought before there were anti-satellite weapons. Now there are anti-satellite weapons. There's intelligence reports. There are other ways to attack satellites from satellites attacking each other. And so we need to think that space may become a warfighting domain. We need to plan for the future. So those discussions were about that. And then, your point is exactly right. There were several classified and unclassified sessions. I would say that the classified sessions, what you normally would do is talk about the future. What does it look like at the current rates we're investing in the year 2030 or 2040? And what does it look like when you see what the rate at which China is investing up in 2030, 2040? And that got people's attention when you showed what was going to happen in 2030 if we continued not focusing upon space. And that's what the Creation Space Force really does. It helps get resources towards space assets. The old criticism had been that the Department of the Air Force runs space, but it's the redheaded stepchild. It doesn't get the resources it really needs because every time you prioritize what you need, it's all about jets and fighter pilots and everything else.
Did you have to be on message speaking with Congress and the media, like, there's no air in space?
No.
Just little quotable things like that, right?
No, we definitely had to be on message. We definitely had to tell a story in the narrative. The other thing, I think, the Department of Defense has not changed since 1947. Many people say, well, let's look at what we did in 1947 creating the Air Force. But that's really not the best model. The best model was because in 1947, there had been the Department of War, which was really the Army, and the Department of the Navy with the Marine Corps. So in 1947, they created the Department of Defense, they created the Joint Staff, and then they created the Air Force. So we're not looking for that big a change. We're just creating a department. And we actually looked to 1918 to the Royal Air Force as being created in the British. And so that was one of our narratives and if you look at that, they were planning for the future. And because of what they did, they had the Spitfire, the best fighter that helped them win the Battle of Britain. And then they made a huge investment in radar, which again helped them win the Battle of Britain. Wouldn't have won it without radar. And those were acquisition strategy decisions. And that's exactly what a service does. It thinks about acquisition strategy. The converse is for the American Air Forces, you had the U.S. Army Air Forces prior to World War II. They had made an acquisition strategy decision that invested in long-range bombers with lots of 50 cals, the fortresses, the super fortresses that didn't have a long-range escort fighters. And that led to more casualties in the 8th Air Force, just one portion of the Air Force, than the entire Marine Corps combined. So bad acquisition strategy decision. And so, we're thinking about the future. We need a service. So that generally got some traction as well.
Do you have any lessons learned about pitching Congress?
Yes, I do. So, the biggest thing is, like I said, we put together work group after work group to work on all these policy decisions. What are the decisions? And then let's draft the legislation to get the decisions we came to. And then, we delivered that and talked with Congress over months. But many times, I think it would have been better to bring Congress in earlier. While we're still making the policy decision, say, hey, we're thinking about going this way. What do you guys think about it? Make them part of the conversation before we came to, here's what we think is the best route. Because they had their own views on things, and ultimately they were going to own the pen. So I think the lesson I got from even early on in the decision making process, bring them in. Get their views. It may be that you decide you're not going to ask for what they say, but they would feel more part of the process, and you actually would probably learn why they're going to take the view they're going to take.
I'm imagining like a scene from House of Cards where you've got the whole House and Senate and you've got the for and against, and you're trying to get them on either side. Was it anything like that?
Yeah, it was. But I say, back when I was in the infantry in Italy, we used to play this game called American Ball. It was a big 6-foot ball. And, you'd line up half of an infantry company on one side of the goal line, half on the other, the ball's in the middle, and you blow the whistle, and the two sides, 200 people running at each other, and you're trying to move the ball. And sometimes the ball's going sideways, and, the only rule was get the ball across the goal line. And there were lots of people doing a lot of things, sometimes trying to move the ball forward, some back, some to the sidelines wanted to put it aside. So, it took a lot of effort, and there are a lot of competing priorities, and you had people in the House on both sides who were very supportive of space, but you had some in the House, particularly just because it was President Trump's idea, who didn't want to move it forward, and then you had the Vice President, who was a very big player in negotiating quite a bit.
Did you get questions from Congress about UFOs, for example?
We didn't actually get many comments. I know that's a current topic of much concern, but it was not one that we had to.
How about questions about the logo? The logo's a pretty recognizable logo.
We did, and when we first rolled out the seal, there was actually a lot of people who kind of showed that it looked a lot like one of the Star Trek patches, but we had been in conversations with CBS Paramount before that. The unknown story that some might know is that little tri-delta we call, that is part of both the logo and the seal now, and it's in the Star Trek, but theirs is more stylized and rounded. Well, someone had worked for the space program back in the 50s and 60s in the Air Force, and he went to work for Paramount Films. And so he took some of the things that he had been wearing and some of the logos that he'd been wearing, and he then designed that logo. So CBS Paramount, they agreed that they did not have the exclusive rights to that Delta symbol. And so that
as a lawyer,
negotiations.
As a lawyer, I can only imagine that there was more than a couple letters going back and forth.
There were a lot of different discussions.
One does not simply get CBS Paramount to just agree that you can use the Star Trek logo.
Yeah. Well, we and obviously ours looks a little different than theirs, so it ended up working out.
Did you send them overhead reconnaissance of what their movies that are being produced? Just kind
there were no threats involved.
There
whatsoever.
You go. How about the Space Force show on Netflix?
Yeah, that was interesting because my office was actually right next door to the office of General Raymond, the first chief of space operations. Of course, Steve Carell plays General Raymond in that show, Space Force. So Jay Raymond said to me, they're scoping me out because the stuff on the walls of his office is from my office. So they actually definitely were trying to find things about Jay and use that, try to make that more real. But and there were some funny parts of that show, but there were a lot that was not realistic as well.
When it first came out, I thought it was going to be sort of an anti, Trump kind of establishment, but it was actually very pro-American.
It was
very pro-space, very pro-leadership. There's a scene where Steve Carell's testifying before Congress,
right,
and a congresswoman asks him about why does it cost $18,000 to send an orange into space, and it was just kind of like, that's an amazing quote, and it's all about keeping that person tied to humanity, and I just thought that was awesome.
Yeah.
So
well, the other thing they show several things that the Chinese were, what they were doing in space, and so you saw just this week, right? The Chinese many other nations have tried beside the United States to land a probe on Mars. The Chinese have just done it. So where the EU and Russia has failed, they have succeeded. So they are advancing in space quicker than anybody knows. I think it's also amazing. Again, not being I don't know the physics. I know orbit physics is hard, but when you look at the moon, our Earth is spinning around and we're revolving around the sun, but we always see just one side of the moon. On the far side of that moon is a Chinese probe. We don't know what it's doing because we can't see it unless we send something over there to look at it. So the Chinese have a very advanced space program, and they have designs for surpassing us as the world leader in space. And so we've got to take that very serious. And I think that point was well made by the show. I was surprised it was made.
I was happy to see that made, and it was some of the, I think the portrayals of China was a little, I'm going to say Asian racist, maybe even go in there.
Yeah.
But it was pretty interesting just how they did it. I'm really hoping there's a season 2.
Yeah.
I thought it was really good. There's some amazingly funny stuff in there.
Was.
But
the dogs are not, the chimps are not. Were fantastic.
It's really good stuff, and it's I was surprised to see it on Netflix, to tell you the truth, but it was really, really good. Yeah. What other kinds of fiction, whether it's books or movies or shows on TV, are influencing your thoughts on cybersecurity or space?
Boy, other fiction books. I would say the Ghost Fleet one, I'm looking forward to other efforts like that. I read a lot of history, so that influences me more than fiction. But I like historic fiction too. So there's lots of historic fiction that I've read. The Patrick O'Brian series, about the seas, the Hornblower series. And so even though I'm a long-term Army guy,
Army Air Force, you got a lot of Navy stuff
but I
going
got
on there.
a lot of Navy stuff that I read as well. So maybe that's influenced why I thought of this idea. And I know some have thought about it and written about it. I actually hadn't read those before. And it's interesting. The same day that my article was published in the Wall Street Journal, Admiral Stavridis did an article in Bloomberg Press that was similar.
So was he 4 letters Marque?
He is as well. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's very interesting. So I'll put that in the show notes. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
So just finished Ghost Fleet. 2034 is the next, and then I'm going to be reading Richard Thiem's Mobius, which is about it's a composite of everybody he's met from the intelligence community. So, except not you. No.
So I think another interesting book is the Coming AI Superpower. It's several years old now, but the whole idea that when Henry Ford built the Model T, there were lots of people who had mechanic ability in the United States, and we thrived. And China is, they are building the number of engineers to be able to work in the big data universe and in the cyber universe. They're educating huge masses of the population, and we're falling behind. Is the
well, if you could change that here in the United States, what would you do? How would you change K through 12? How would you change government policy on education for this stuff?
So you kind of mentioned it before, Ron. Cyber looks sexy and sounds sexy until you start doing it. Then it's a lot of hard work. You've got to have some skills. So I think every young person, they want to be involved in adventure. They want to be involved in a purpose-filled life. And so how do we attract them to working in the cyber field? I mean, it's where the swashbucklers of the future are going to go. So, and they need to have the tools to go there. So you've got a lot of people who are in their basement playing games and probably could translate those skills to coding and to cyber defense and cyber attack pretty easily. But we haven't found a way to tap into them to, give them an excitement about doing some of the hard work so they could actually get to the exciting part.
How do you respond to one of the criticisms of the education system in the United States is that STEM places too much focus on math and engineering, and it doesn't leave enough time to develop critical thinking, being creative, being artistic. And that those kind of theories or those kind of skills might be more important than being great at spreadsheets in the future.
No, I think that's a great point. So I'll tell a story about my son who is a junior in high school. He did not like math, did not like calculus. He took a STEM engineering class where he worked on what was called the West Point Bridge Project. And so the whole idea was to design a bridge and then build it with a solder and small pipe and see whose bridge can then have the most weight. And so it was creative. You had to figure out the math, and you had to figure out how to use a computer. And because of that, he said, maybe I should apply to West Point if this stuff because it was the West Point's computer bridge building project. And then he decided to go to West Point in many respects because that creative tool fired him up to say, okay, I can swallow the math and the other courses I need to take to continue in the STEM field. So we've got to figure out how to make it not just Pythagorean's theorem and math problems, but creative efforts.
How do you look at the university system with more and more people going to community colleges or just going straight to getting certifications? Is that an opportunity to kind of get more people into data science, computer programming, and cybersecurity?
I hope so. I like the idea of folks not necessarily needing a Bachelor of Science to work in the cyber field. They can if they go get some skills, because if you get a Bachelor of Science, it might be when you get a job, most of your training is going to be on the job training anyway. So let's give people a shorter path so they can go to work. They can see it's actually exciting. They're getting paid, and then they can get some education on the side as they see, okay, I need some more education. So I think that's a better model sometimes in the cyber world.
As a lawyer,
Yeah.
do you think there needs to be more practicing law people who are familiar with the cybersecurity practices, cybersecurity policy, cybersecurity law?
Yeah, well, there's a real shortage of intellectual property lawyers and lawyers who, probably the national security cyberspace is pretty small, pretty much in the government. But I think if this idea, let us Mark, take hold, I mean, they're going to be more involved. Also the intellectual property lawyers, such a unique specialty, it takes so much extra training that very few go into that. Although it's supply and demand. So those who go into it, it's pretty lucrative. So I think that field will grow as well.
Do you speak at conferences?
I do.
How do people approach you? What do they do? You have topics you like to speak on?
Well, lately I've been speaking about the creation of the Space Force. Lots of panels about space, what's going on in space, also in cyber, because again, particularly in both my time in the Army and the Air Force, there are some projects that we're working on and some efforts we're working on in cyber defense. And I think the Air Force has really got the key role in acquiring the tools for our cyber defense right now.
Excellent. Well, where can people find you if they want to contact you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and I have not yet launched my Lead Up Strategies webpage, but I'll be doing that shortly.
That's awesome. Well, General, thank you very much for your service. Thanks for coming on the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. And thanks for everybody. Oh, wow. Thanks everybody for watching from home, your car, or wherever you're watching. Ron Gula signing out.